Hello. As we move from thinking about the sociological imagination into our next section here, I wanted to create a little video here to introduce some concepts. All of this stuff, the beauty of sociology is that none of this is rocket science because I don't deal with rockets very often, but I do live in a social world. So all of these things, the theories are drawn from the lives that we live, and we can take those theories and apply them readily, which makes it a whole lot easier to understand. And yet, some of this stuff is still complicated. So I wanted to kind of build a bridge between the sociological imagination, and then as we sort of get into thinking about labor and work, um, relationality, alienation, and estrangement, or some conceptual topics that we're going to dig into here. And there are connections that I want to make sure that we get, and then also provide a little bit more of a maybe an easier, more connected, applicable understanding of what Karl Marx was talking about in terms of alienation in particular, because his ideas are, I think, generally not very well understood, and sometimes people stay in this like theoretical place for too long, and it doesn't connect to anything that means a whole lot. So I want to help with that. So first, we talked about the sociological imagination already. Essentially, we're connecting individual problems, the things that we face individually, and public issues, Mills called them, but social structures. So whether that's tax policy or what we have criminalized or any number of different things. It's connecting the individual. We, especially in the United States, we are hyper focused on the individual, which is not all a bad thing, um, but it distracts us sometimes from the larger context that shapes the kinds of choices that we get to make. We just sort of treat them as if they're all the same choice, and that's never actually true. We all start our lives in a very particular location historically, in a particular body, and there are all sorts of things that go with that. So our choices are shaped. But there is this relationship between individual and social structure in between there. So building on that, there's this concept here that I think is going to be a helpful bridge. It's relationality. And what that means is that because there is this relationship between these two things, we're going to focus here. Relationality is like, I'm a father because I have a child. If I did not have a child, I would not be a father. So these things depend on one another for existence, essentially. Trying to think of another example. If you're familiar with any of MC Escher's artwork, there's one that I like to use. Like if we're in a classroom, I can put it up. You can pause this and do a quick Google search. But he's got one that it is geese flying in the air, and then down below there are fish swimming in water, maybe a pond, and the space around the geese, if you continue looking down, is actually the shape of the fish. And by the time you get to the fish, you can see that the space between the fish is actually the geese. So one literally creating the other. So there's a relationship. If you take away the geese, I'm not sure what happens to the fish. But if I did not have children, then I would not be a father or a parent. So it is that relationship where one is necessarily defined by and sort of created in a way by the existence of the other. So there's this connection between the two that cannot be severed. That's relationality. There's another closely connected concept that is dialectical production, is what this is called. Dialectics, maybe. Essentially, all that means is if you change one, so the fish and the geese, I'll use that one. If you change one, then you inherently change the other. So if you make that goose up there look more like a duck, that fish is also going to change. Or if you change the goldfish into a swordfish, you're going to end up with some weird looking birds. I don't know. I don't know what they are. But because you have changed one, you also then inherently, because they are connected, you change the other. That is essentially what dialectical production means. It is, maybe there's another parallel. If you throw a stone in the water, the ripples go out and they impact other things. If policy changes, going back to the sociological imagination, if policy changes, then that'll also shift how it impacts me. It could be anything from, like if you're looking for a car and there's a tax rebate on something, and that tax rebate goes away, that's going to change the way that you experience the world and choices that you make and all sorts of other things. So those are sort of a package of things. Sociological imagination, relationality, and dialectical production. And relationality and dialectical production are slightly different, but they are very, very connected because they are about that relationship that the sociological imagination tries to describe. Feel free to pause if you have questions there. Send me an email, whatever that might be. But those are some important pieces as we continue on. It's how we can start to understand how all of this is connected. One last thing on sort of this bridge between the two maybe conceptual groupings, we'll call them. The sociological imagination, if you haven't caught this quite yet, shorthand that people use to remember. So if you're thinking about the relationship that I have to all of society beyond me, social structures, etc., that can be overwhelming, and you might not know where to start. So, and sociologists are no different, we talk about spec, S-P-E-C, so you can spec it out. If you haven't heard somebody say that, which you may not have in an intro class, you may in higher level classes talk about spec it out. What that means is thinking about it in terms of social, political, economic, and cultural, S-P-E-C, social, political, economic, and cultural levels of society. Social would be more your sort of informal social groups, friends, community, church, whatever that might be for you. Political, don't think about it in terms of political parties, but how political power moves and is structured. And here we're talking about certainly local and state governments, who has power in your community to shape policy, those kinds of things. Economic, fairly straightforward, but thinking about how economies are structured, what sort of things are incentivized, what sort of labor protections might be in place. Different industries have different relationships to that. That also has to do with place to some degree. But anyway, the economic level, and here we're talking about finances, could also talk about different kinds of economies, because there is sort of the mom and pop shop where I go buy something and the money that I spend there gets spent somewhere else locally, and it sort of circulates. And that's kind of the way that we tend to think about an economy working. There is also the investment economy and Wall Street and those kinds of things, which is often how the news talks about the health of our economy. But that only is something that is accessible to those who have money to invest. And if you don't have discretionary spending, let's call it, but if you don't have like some extra money that you can take some risks on, if you're not just paying bills and you have some extra money and you can invest it to make that money work for you, then you can participate in this other thing, and that's about capital flow and other things. But that's a separate kind of economy. But that is the kind of thing that we're talking about in terms of the economics. So SPEC, cultural, those are more like your cultural norms, traditions. They're the kinds of things that we have in my family, for instance. I was once an exchange student. We have had several. Those are often the kinds of things that you have to explain are very different in this particular culture than what you're used to doing, the way that you're used to doing them somewhere else. Some of that could be laws. For instance, I spent a year in Germany. At 16, I could buy beer, but at 18, you drive. Those kinds of differences, those are cultural. They may also be political, but they tend to be cultural. Okay, so that's spec. That's a little shorthand to help things out. I'm going to end this video here, but I do want this is my purpose here is that this is sort of a transition point to then get us into the next video, where I'll talk a little bit more about alienation and estrangement and Marx's ideas around work and how that might connect to labor, and then on down the line how that's about estrangement and dehumanization, and how that begins then to like give us some concepts to use beyond how we might think about it in terms of economics, but to push beyond that. I do want to say really quickly before I get into that video, and I'll start there too. We have a lot of stereotypes about what Karl Marx means. It's a man's name, but there's a lot of things connected to it. Some of that is totally fair. Some of it is not. It's not really based in a whole lot of facts. What we're going to focus on is his critique of capitalism and some of his early ideas, not so much the solutions that he came up with later on. And that's usually where the stereotypes and things get attached. But I do want you to, as you start into the next video and thinking about his ideas, we're starting early on with some of his foundational sort of thinking and really his critiques before he got to anything else. So keep an open mind and see if maybe some of these theories don't actually sound pretty familiar, because they probably are. Anyway, we'll get to that next in part 2.